Well, hi everybody. I guess my hummingbird video wasn't as popular as some I've made. Actually, there have only been one or two videos that got any sizable viewing. But anyway, it was something I was thinking about yesterday, and I was talking with my wife about it, and we both had grown up in the Bible students, or at least with a Bible student influence. She did not come from the strict Bible student background that I grew up with. Although her father was a devoted and dedicated Bible student, they were isolated by location, where there weren't many Bible students for much of her life growing up. And her mother was adamantly opposed to the Bible students because her husband, my father-in-law, found the Bible students later in life after they were married through his mother. And so my wife never really grew up with a quote-unquote Bible student childhood. And yet, later in life, she was convinced, compelled by her father to seek refuge, to seek help within the quarters of the Bible students movement. On the other hand, I grew up in the thick of it, probably right at the very heart of the Bible students movement. As I've mentioned a number of times, my family dated back in the religion to the days of Charles Taze Russell on both my mother's and father's side. And they were very devout. The family was very devout. My extended family, all my aunts and uncles, all my cousins, everyone in my family were Bible students, or strongly influenced in the Bible student religion. One of the values, one of the cultural aspects of the Bible students is this idea of being in the world but not of it. I'm sure many Jehovah's Witnesses have heard that. This dates back to the earliest days of the Bible students movement, which includes the break off of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, they do have a lineage through the Watchtower back to the early days of Russell and many of the doctrines that are believed in by the Jehovah's Witnesses today came from Russell's era. I mean, let's face it. I don't know what kind of spin the governing body is trying to put on the movement before 1919. I mean, Rutherford got the ball rolling that he was trying to distance the organization from Russell's teachings, and it was problematic for him to have to inherit a presidency in 1917 with a movement of about roughly 50,000 Bible students that were wholly dedicated to Russell and thought that Russell was that Laodicean messenger. And so, growing up, there was this very insular, very isolated culture within the Bible students. No, we didn't live in compounds or lived in like the Mormons, physically away from society. We we're not that big, for one thing, and but you can isolate yourself within the community. I mean, there's no question. You just don't befriend yourself with the neighbors. You're at an interminable number of meetings when you grow up, and you are constantly reinforced with this idea of being in the world but not of it. And that was really, really strongly enforced, reinforced over and over again, this idea. But you can't be wholly separated from the world now, can you? And the world were anybody who didn't accept this religion and this idea that you're special, that you're endowed with the Holy Spirit, which opens up your mind of understanding to the scriptures for your hope to become one of the 144,000, to have this special standing in the universe, to be among those that are in heaven with God. That was the hope that was put before Bible students during Russell's day, and the Bible students that ended up separating from the Watchtower as a result of Rutherford. Rutherford then kind of changed this, made it a little more exclusive as to who was, who could make it into the 144,000, although they didn't put specific limits. They didn't do it explicitly. They did it a little less in a little less obvious way. But it turned out that the majority of those that were coming into the Watchtower and joining the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't have this desire to have a heavenly hope. A perfect earth would be exclusive enough for them to be the sole survivors of a Holocaust of a scale that we've never seen before, where only a relative handful, several millions out of billions, surviving and inheriting this world, a perfect world where you have an elephant in your front yard and a lion cub playing in the backyard with bunny rabbits. I mean, this fantasy world is so childish and naive that it's for anybody it would just look ridiculous. But anyway, the idea of separating yourself from the world is a very conceptual thing, and you can do it by attending large numbers of meetings and not mixing in with people socially, and separating yourself from family members who are not within the organization. And this was true with the Bible students, and we grew up with this idea that we didn't belong. And when you feel like you don't belong, it gives you this idea that you're different, you're inferior. And people don't like that. I mean, we're very social creatures. I think there was something very interesting. It was called Of Ants and Men. Take a look at that documentary. There's a fellow from Harvard. He's from Alabama. I'm having a senior moment at this present time, but I can't think of his name, but I think his last name's Wood. But anyway, Advancing Men. He wrote a book, and he's a highly reputed biologist, world-renowned. And he, interestingly, came from Alabama, one of the most biodiverse states in the United States, which is an interesting little fact that I didn't know. But we are called super social animals, and there are only 19 such species of all social animals. Even chimpanzees don't make it in the super social. It's animals like ants and other creatures. There are 19 different species that he identified as being super social. That we have a super social culture and interaction, like a hive, and we are the only mammal that has this characteristic. And so it really is not, it runs very contrary to our very being to be asocial or antisocial, to deliberately separate yourself from the world. We're looking for acceptance. We're looking to contribute. We're looking to some way to help one another. And often they's religions that say you're of the world, you're in the world, but not of it, they're telling you to become your own intra social system or dynamic, and that way they can control you. So, when you leave a cult, and when you leave a religion of that nature, or even a mainstream religion, which has removed itself from the definition of cult and became part of the mainstream culture, it still reflects some of these aspects of a cult, and it removes you from what you really are through the millions of years of evolution that brought us into being. And last year, in fact, it's exactly a year ago, I had one of the most traumatic experiences when I had my what they call bilateral knee replacement, double knee replacement. That was probably one of the most physically traumatic experiences that I've ever experienced. And truly, there at one point I didn't think I was ever going to be able to walk again. It was that intrusive, that impactful. But anyway, I knew I was going to have a lot of downtime, and something I've always been interested in was genealogy, because I didn't know much about my family. And this is because we kept ourselves separate from the world. It didn't matter what your family was. The only family that mattered were those that were a part of this Russell movement. And so we only knew about as far back as my grandparents. They talked a little about their parents, but never really in a positive way, because they predated the Watchtower and weren't part of the Bible Students movement. And this was true for both sides of my family. And I had that as a kid. I wanted to know, who were these? Who was Grandpa Miller? and I heard stories, that he fell off his horse in the Civil War, and in the chaos of a retreat, and he was in the Union Army, and he was in the artillery, and as he was mounting a horse, he slipped and fell. And at that moment, a cannon rolled across his chest, crushing his chest. Those old horse-drawn cannon wheels, and I wanted to know more. There was this thing, and talking with my maternal grandfather, who I was very close to. I was frankly closer to my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, than I was with my own parents. I looked to them. They were my pattern. They were my because they showed unconditional love. Certainly, they were not perfect people. But my grandfather was an accomplished man. Despite being a Bible student, he was converted into the Bible students and at the age of 38 by my grandmother, who had grown up in the Bible students. She knew Russell. And so my grandfather already had begun a career, and he became a New York banker. And as a New York banker, he rose highly in the banking world, in the oldest bank in New York, the oldest savings bank in New York, the Bank for Savings, established in 1802. And he worked with people like William Howard Taft II, the nephew of the president. He worked with Archibald Roosevelt in the banking world, who was the son of Theodore Roosevelt. So he moved in this culture of society, of the upper echelons of the world. And as a result, some of the hypocrisy of the Bible students is that if a person is influential in the world, they had some higher standing and more respect than those who were of the more mainstream accepted backgrounds, and not, let's say, individuals that had excelled in some aspect of their life in some superior way, because we weren't supposed to seek these things. We weren't supposed to pursue these things. Despite the fact that we didn't have any official policy about college, we were discouraged from going to college. It didn't stop many of my peers from going to college, but it did stop a good number. I would say that there's a lower percentage of those my age and the Bible students that had college degrees than those contemporaries in the world. So there were elders that talked about us being influenced in college the wrong way. We could become atheists. We could become evolutionists. And, maybe their fears were right, because in my situation, it ultimately led in that direction. But that's because the evidence proves, or the evidence is so overwhelmingly supportive of the scientific perspective that it'd be ridiculous not to accept it. So I thought, well, now my knees, I'm going to have a lot of time. It's not something I could do, in a hospital bed. And I was in a hospital for quite a while. And I had my computer with me all the time, and And I began working on my ancestry. Now, I had bought an ancestry account back in 2005, but I didn't do a whole lot with it. It takes a lot of time. To do real research, one of the things that I found is that an error can get propagated within ancestry, not intentionally, and it grows because other people accept that this research is correct, and it propagates the errors. So it's all the more important to have the facts, to have the research. And while on one hand it makes doing your genealogy more difficult, it presents the challenge, which I always like, is a challenge, an intellectual challenge, and it is something quite investigative, forensically investigative. You're investigating your own family, your own heritage. And as I got involved in this, it just blew me away. You can see I'm bolder. I lost a lot of hair over the last year. Anyway, it blew me back. When I found about my family is absolutely phenomenal to me, but I think it could be of interest to others. Not that I'm going to be telling you of my genealogy, but I had fragments. I had fragments from my grandfather. For example, this nautical telescope. My great-grandfather had a boat. He was an inventor. He had invented an engine in 1905 that was about 75 years ahead of its time. Honda cited his patent in their CVCC engine of the 1970s. So he didn't make really anything from his engine design, but it was so advanced that it really didn't make it into the mainstream automotive manufacturing until the Japanese took it in the 1970s. And they referenced back to his patent, which I found interesting. And I found a number of other patents, and he was fascinated with automobiles. He was mechanically inclined. I was an auto mechanic when I started, so maybe I inherited that from him. But he had 7 patents that I could find, and there are possibly more. All of them had to do with engine designs or with cars in some way. You think back to 1900, the automobile was a very crude instrument. This is before the Model T. And yes, they did have some brands like Buick and others, but they weren't mass-produced in the way the Model T was, and they were very rudimentary. For example, transmissions were slipping belts. They didn't have these automatic transmission, and they didn't even have gears. They used belt and pulley systems, and you slipped the belt onto a bigger pulley and got different gear ratios as a result, and the car would, increase its speed. And so he did these designs. My grandson just came home. I'm going to stop for a minute. So anyway, my grandson came home. I had to stop, relocate, and I was talking about cars when I left. But I started this genealogy, and I began to learn about my family for the very first time. Here I am. I'm a guy into his 60s, well into his 60s, and I'm finding out, in essence, who I am for the first time. And just one little side point I wanted to make, that there's a point to Oh, look at this. That's from this umbrella. I opened it up and all this stuff fell out. We had a thunderstorm this morning. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to be competing with a little wind too, so I'm sorry about that. But anyway, I had some items that belonged to my great-grandfather. Like I mentioned, he had a boat. This here was my great-grandfather's telescope. My grandfather had it, and it was in decrepit condition. And I took it apart back in the 1980s, and I recently re-leathered it. I sewed it myself and cleaned it up a little bit. I believe this telescope goes back to the early 1800s. It's probably about 200 years old. And my great-grandfather had bought it because he had a boat. And he had designed an engine for that boat. And so I have his nautical compass, had a little oil lamp built into the side of the box. It's a floating compass so that it points north. I could probably show it, but I'm not. I just don't feel like getting up again. And other items that are connections to the past, to a person I never met, a person who died 5 years before me, but I've been able to get to know him through his patents, through the photographs, through the stories I can still remember that came from my grandfather. And I have a connection to the past that all my life I was discouraged to enjoying, because we were to downplay and these things weren't important in our lives. It was funny because I have a very unique last name. There are probably 800 people in the entire planet that have my last name. People mess it up all the time. But and it's only 5 letters. It's a German name. And my grandfather, on my father's side, my paternal grandfather, his mother and father divorced when he was about 10. He was an only child. This was in the late 1890s, and he never knew whatever happened to his father. And as far as we understood, our family history stopped at him. And when I found another person with my initials on AOL, I was intrigued, and I contacted him, and it turned out that we made a connection. And that connection was that he was my third cousin, and he pronounced the name exactly the same as we pronounce the name. There are various ways in which it could be pronounced, and I found that the way we pronounced it was unique, and so it was sure that this was my family, just another branch of it. And I've been able since with Ancestry to refine that understanding. And my family on my father's side actually came from Germany in 1856. But when I found these things out back in the late 90s, I put together a little paternal family tree of the things that I had learned and known, and passed them on to all of my family members, and I got zip interest. It's because of this. We are in the world, not of it. Value. Let's call it a value, and I just was surprised that there was such a lack of interest in that. And I remember talking with my grandparents before they died as a young man, in my late teens, early 20s, and trying to pick their brains as much as I could to find out what it was like when they grew up, what their experiences were, because I wanted to know. It was a part of who I am today, because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. And so when I had my knees done, I thought this was a perfect opportunity. I had been a member of Ancestry since 2005. And the wind is ready to take my table off and into the air. I'm sorry about if it doesn't sound good. But anyway, I found some very unique, very interesting things that connected me not only to my family but to history. And just as a quick example, I had mentioned earlier that my grandfather, his name was Felix Southard Wassman. He worked for the oldest bank in New York City, the Bank for Savings. Doesn't exist anymore, of course, but his boss was William Howard Taft II. I don't know if you can read. There we go. That is an angle that catches the light. He got his nameplate. My grandfather was a pallbearer at his funeral. And this is my grandfather, F.S. Wassman, Felix Southard Wassman. And I knew that the Southards were an older family just from talking with him. His mother was born a Southard, and his grandfather was named Felix. And so he was named after his grandfather. But he didn't know anything about his grandparents. He never met any of them except maybe his mother. And when I looked and dug into the family history a little bit, I found some really interesting things. One thing, and I applied for it, was that I am related to the Buckingham family. That my second great-grandmother was Sarah Buckingham. That she was Sarah Canfield Buckingham. The Canfields are an old American family. The Buckinghams are an old American family. In fact, Thomas Buckingham, who's my seventh direct great-grandfather, was a founder of Yale University. He's one of the 10 founders. If you look for the founders of Yale University, he's one of them. And he was a reverend in the British colony of Saybrook. They didn't call it Old Saybrook then. Now it is, in Connecticut. And his father immigrated into the Americas in 1636. His name was Thomas Southard. He was married in England. They were part of the Great Puritan immigration in the 1600s, 1620 to 1640, and he was of the Buckingham family that is renowned in Buckingham Palace today. And there's certainly a lot going on now around Buckingham Palace. So it's interesting to be able to make that connection into history. And there are many more things. My third great-grandfather, George Buckingham, Sarah's father, was a renowned individual in early New York. In fact, if you look at the movie The Gangs of New York, my great-grandfather basically walked out of that movie. He was a fireman. He was prominent in the fire department. His name is mentioned in numerous publications, the New York Times, and many history books. I had no knowledge of this. And I'm not even sure that my grandfather really understood this. And even though his mother grew up in George Buckingham's home for the first 10 years of her life, her father died, Felix Southard, when she was an infant, and her mother, Sarah, went back to live with her parents because women didn't have means to support themselves in the 19th century and earlier. We didn't have Social Security. We didn't have all of the helps that we do today in case something tragic happens in your life. We're very fortunate today. And, people say, let's go back to the good old years. They weren't so good, especially if you were a woman who had to fend for herself in the 19th century. But I found out that George ran against for New York Commissioner of Schools in 1850 against William Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall, and beat him. He had won that election when Tweed was looking to find a political position. Both he and Tweed were very heavily involved in the fire department, and Tweed was trying to get into office so that he really basically could enrich himself. He turned out to be a very corrupt politician, but he made the history books. And my great-grandfather ran against him and beat him in an election. George also was part of the 71st New York Militia. It's a renowned regiment. It's the only regiment from the 19th century that's still in the Army today. And they were called the American Eagle Regiment. And they were based in New York City, and he had risen to the rank of major. They were headed up by Colonel Vosburgh, who started the regiment in around 1850. They were a part of the funeral procession for Daniel Webster. So my great-great-great-grandfather is named as one of the people involved in the honoring of Daniel Webster, the great statesman, American statesman of the 19th century. And I'm starting to see these things for the very first time in my life. And I started to get a feeling like, holy cow, because all of my life I felt lesser than. I had this weird last name. I was in this weird religion that didn't allow me to play with my friends. I was always at meetings and where we had to sit quietly, and we were constantly fed that we were separate from the world, and this was all because of the controlling influences of the religion. And this religion was centered and built around the Laodicean messenger, Charles Taze Russell, founder of the Watchtower, founder of the Bible Students movement, and the split-off movement known as Jehovah's Witnesses. So the point I'm getting at is that the aim of cults, the aim of that cult in particular, is to make you feel out of place. And for the first time in my life, I'm 67 years old, 67, and I feel like I belong. I belong. I can place myself in history. I applied for Sons of the American Revolution because I have a great-grandfather, George Buckingham's wife, Anne Luff. Her grandfather, he's my fifth great-grandfather, Nathaniel Luff, became a Quaker later, went to medical school and became a surgeon during the time of the Revolution in Philadelphia. And in his early 20s, he joined the Continental Army. As anybody who has studied American history knows, that in 1776, 77, things weren't going all that well for the Revolution. And George Washington, it's amazing that he survived the Battle of New York, because they almost were wiped off the map by the British Army. 20,000 soldiers sailed into New York Harbor and just overran New York City. Of course, New York City wasn't the great metropolis that it is today. It wasn't even the largest city in the United States. Charleston was the economic and financial center of America back in the colonial period. And his army was basically annihilated in the Battle of New York, and the great triumph of that was Washington's retreat. And he managed to get across the Hudson River with several thousands of his soldiers, and they marched to southern New Jersey and Pennsylvania, south central New Jersey, and the winter was coming on, and they were losing men left and right, and their conscriptions were ending in early December, or the end of December, and Washington was concerned that the revolution was going to fail, because they needed something for their morale, something to pick up the spirits of the army, to get enlistment back up again, because this was all volunteer. There was no government, really. There was a Continental Congress, but they only had the ability to fund the army, and the army depended on people supporting the revolution. And things weren't good at that time. And Washington, here he is in Pennsylvania, and it's Christmas Day, and he makes a fateful decision to attack the Hessian garrison in Trenton on the day after Christmas. So on Christmas night, in the midst of a nor'easter, and this was still during the end of the Little Ice Age, and the winters were colder then, the Delaware River was blocked with ice, and he was down to an army of about 2,000 men, when he started out with an army earlier that summer of about 20,000 men. He went from 20,000 to 2,000, and the Hessians were renowned. They were mercenaries, but all throughout Europe they were known as the top fighting army in the world. The highest class soldiers there were, even better than the British soldiers. And the Hessian garrison was set up in Trenton, New Jersey. And so Washington took a bold chance, and on a stormy night where it was raining, sleeting, snowing. If anybody lives on the East Coast, you know what a winter nor'easter is like. And these men crossed that Delaware. Of course, it took them a little longer than he expected, because he wanted to get there before sunrise to Trenton, cross the river 9 miles above Trenton, and then march into Trenton at around daybreak and a surprise attack. His plan largely was a success. He had 3 prongs. Only one of them made it across the river, and that was the one with my my fifth great-grandfather, Nathaniel Luff. And he wrote a journal and described all of this in his journal. He was part of that one threadbare hope of saving the dream of freedom for this country. And they routed the Hessians, this rabble of barefoot soldiers, starving, and they marched into Trenton, and they took the Hessians by surprise and took 900 prisoner. There was a garrison, I think, of 1,500 men there, and there were a number of casualties. I forget the number of casualties. The Americans only lost 2 men who froze to death on the march to Trenton. 9-mile march in this awful weather and night. And when I learned about that, I got emotional, because it took dedication, it took belief in these men to give us what we have today. Before Washington took those men across that river, he read them Thomas Paine, and he talked about the summer soldier and the good weather patriot. Anyway, these were the men that saved America and saved the dream, and the British were shocked. And then 2 weeks later, Washington did it again in a brilliant strategic battle against the Cornwallis in Princeton, and then another rout of the British took them by surprise. This was a British army. It was a real army of 12,000 men, and by this point Washington had been able to raise numbers, because the Battle of Trenton stimulated recruitment, and in 2 weeks again they beat the British, and then they retired for the winter up in Morristown. But there was still a long ways to go. This was 1777, early 1777, and the war continued another 4 years. But if it hadn't been for that event and those 2 battles, we'd be a British colony, and we would be mourning the Queen right now. We would be like Australia, probably pretty much independent, but still beholden to this antiquated system. I'm proud that we have an English heritage, but what we did here back then with those men, those patriots, those people who conceived the principles of liberty, yes, there were flaws, there were problems, but it's a beginning, and we're still seeking a solution to many of those problems. They didn't leave. It's not that long, really. It's not that long since then. I have my third great-grandfather. Again, this is all stuff that I've learned. Third great-grandfather, Timothy Southard, was born in the 18th century, in the year 1799. He had, through his second marriage, a daughter, Anne May, in 1867. And he was born in 1799, and his daughter Anne, was born in 1867 or 1866, and she lived well into her 90s and died in 1959, well into her 90s. Her lap overlapped mine. Her father, my third great-grandfather, was born in the 18th century. There was only one person between me and the 18th century, relation-wise, and he was a notable man in Morris County, and he was married into notable families, patriot families from the Revolutionary War, and so these things are the things that I'm learning about who I came from and who these people were, and they had an effect that carried down through the generations to my time, and I want to pass that on to my grandson so that he has a feeling that he belongs, that this is something worth living for. This life, we get one life, and it's worth living for, and having that connection to our past is an amazing way to be able to get that feeling, that sense of belonging. So when you think about what we've done coming out of the Bible students, in my case, the Jehovah's Witnesses, you're freeing yourself to be yourself. It shouldn't be about the problem I see with lay help as opposed to professional help. Things like AA, these are lay help. These are uneducated people uneducated in the area of mental health, for the most part, who are trying to help one another, and that's fine and good, but that doesn't necessarily, you get in a rut. Let's put it this way, in AA, meeting makers make it. So if you don't go to meeting, you're not going to make it. I mean, that's the implication, and so you're bound and tied into this thing, and it controls and dominates your life, and it doesn't allow you to grow as an individual, to be yourself, and you shouldn't be always recovering. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in recovery. It's not that it's necessarily a bad thing to have professional help that might last some time, because much of the time you need somebody to talk to, or you need specific special help in piecing your brain together to help you find who you are. But there's only so much that can be gotten by tying yourself into a singular lay help that doesn't have any form of understanding. You could read all the books yourself. That's not the same as being educated and then having the clinical work behind you. And, it's fine and good to have somebody tell you on a YouTube video how silly this thing sounds. But ultimately, you want your freedom. You want to be who you are, and you want to learn who you are. And I think that those are key points, if any of this makes any sense to you at all. But I see that I've been taking quite a bit of time here, but I found some really, really interesting things about my relatives. And in some cases, I was able to trace my family in one side back to the Norman invasion of England, and also a witch trial of all things. And I think that's fascinating that my family was, the Southern family was involved with the most notorious witch trial that took place in England in 1611. It's the Salisbury witch trial, connected with John Southworth. It's where the name Southard came from. It's a Dutch rendering of the name Southworth, the English name Southworth. And John Salisbury of Salisbury Hall didn't have a very good relationship with his daughter-in-law and called her a witch. Anyway, you can find it on Wikipedia, the Salisbury witch trial, and Jane Southworth. She's something like my 12th and 13th great aunt or something like that. But anyway, I just wanted to get this across because I was thinking about this and what it means, about freedom and about free thinking and critical thinking and being dependent on an individual, or let's say a group of lay people who mean well, but basically can get you trapped again into a cult mentality. And that's what we're trying to break from and to break free from. And it's so easy to slip back into that because we've been trained to think that way, to think insularly, to think that we are different from the rest of the world and that we don't fit in. So I think in some sense, being able to find out who you are and what your past is and the people, getting to know the people and doing that forensic investigation into these individuals and getting to know them to some extent by the things they did, by where they lived, by what they did, by the events surrounding them. It gives you a sense of who you are and where you came from. So anyway, with that, I wish you all the best. You can see everything is blowing away. I hope my voice came through. I tried to talk a little louder. I got to put this umbrella down before it does any damage. The only reason I put it up was the sun. And I wish you all the best. And maybe this will strike a chord with some of you. Life goes by fast. It goes by too fast. And before you know it, you're looking at life more behind you than in front of you. And you want to make the best of it. And that's what it's all about. So I wish you all the best. And until whenever I make another one. So long, everybody.